name is Yona Alexander. I'm the director of the Inter-University Center for Terrorism Studies, and I would like to begin in the interest of time. We're still waiting for two panelists. One of them I spoke about 20 minutes ago is on his way, and hopefully we will have Ambassador Zango from the Embassy of Nigeria, who spoke at our events before. At any rate, I would like to first welcome our panel. I will introduce them in a few minutes. I would like to also welcome the audience, I suppose because of the very dramatic events that are ongoing. It's a very difficult day, but I would like to recognize some of our colleagues. Mr. Saliba from the Law Library of Congress, and Dr. Milton Onig, a nuclear physicist with whom we work for many years on nuclear issues, and some of the diplomats. And particularly I would like to recognize a very distinguished research team that is coordinated by Woody right there. If you want to introduce them for a second. Okay. And
this is our team of interns and research assistants. They're very instrumental in helping us put this event together. They work really hard, doing everything from writing briefs on all the stuff and preparing the professor on the topics that we're going to discuss today. Without them, this event definitely would not be able to happen, and many of the programs that we put on here wouldn't be able to happen. So I want to thank them very much for their hard work.
Obviously, one of our mission here at the Potomac Institute, but also the International Law, is to train the next generation of scholars and specialists in the field, because after all, they would have to deal with many of these challenges for decades to come. We're very proud of them, and they're completing their semester now. We're getting a new group of interns, the summer interns. So that's one of our mission, and I think from the educational point of view, it is really important not only to have an obligation on the intellectual level, but also on the practical level. And we had, I would say, over the years, I didn't count exactly, but we probably had a few thousand people for the past 40 years. One of them I just saw on CNN, Wolf Blitzer, who was my student actually about 40 years ago from Buffalo. We're very proud of him and many of the others. Now, before proceeding with the topic today on refugees, I think it's only proper for all of us to take a moment and to express our sympathies, solidarity, support of the people in Boston, particularly the victims, those who are wounded and their families, those who lost their lives in this terrible tragedy in Boston, and obviously also those who were killed and maimed in Texas. Now, this clearly indicates that we're not just theorizing, about theories, but we're dealing very specifically with the question of saving lives and protecting lives, that this is the first responsibility of government. I don't have to tell you that, but I think what is really important, at least from my perspective, working this area for a long time, that the terrorist attack, it's labeled as a terrorist attack in Boston, was directed not only against the United States, but in many ways against the entire international community. Those who participated in the marathon, obviously, who came from many, many countries. In other words, there was an assault on the freedom of competition and sports and democratic values, as we know. Now, of course, we're going to deal with the issue of refugees. We don't know exactly the details in regard to those suspects in Boston. Apparently, according to the reports, they were Chechens, maybe, or belonged to Chechen family. According to the report, you probably saw one was born in Kyrgyzstan in Central Asia and the other one in Russia. But again, we shouldn't speculate about this. But at any rate, one way or another, they really represented maybe those who came to this country to become Americans, and whether their particular status is a permanent resident or citizen, we'll find out. So again, I would suggest that we follow very closely what develops from the Boston experience. And obviously, if we look at the record, we had refugees who came to this country to escape from persecution, for example, or intolerance, ethnic, racial, religious, tribal. And I remember very vividly back in June 1968, when the candidate for the presidency, Bob Kennedy, was assassinated in Los Angeles by Sirhan, who came from the Middle East. And then, of course, we do have the records of what happened over the years, and incidentally, we're planning to publish it. Those who were refugees, or those who sought citizenship, those who held permanent green cards, and those who were affiliated with groups, foreign groups like Al-Qaeda around the world. Just one more word, because of the unfolding situation, and I cannot see any discussion today without mentioning Boston and the explosions in Texas. Terrible tragedy in terms of human lives, in terms of property, in terms of the impact. And of course, the investigation is still incomplete, except I want to mention that whenever we have an incident in this country or abroad, we have to look at the historical anniversaries. And as far as Texas is concerned, I'm sure that some of you may know that yesterday, today, the 19th, is the 20th anniversary of the Waco incident, the confrontation between federal agents and the religious group there that unfortunately was a terrible incident, and according to the information that we have, some 76 people were killed, including children and including women. And that particular incident mobilized groups against the U.S. Government. And this, of course, brings us to the 17th anniversary on the attack in Oklahoma City, as you know, in 1995, when some 170 or so people were killed and hundreds were injured. And the perpetrator, McVeigh, was convicted, and he was executed back in 2001. So I'm really mentioning all this as a reminder, particularly in the post 9/11, that we have to look at both the situation in the United States in terms of extremist groups on the right and the left, as well as foreign affinity groups as well. And you know, the list goes on, and obviously most recently we know about the reminder actually related to the ricin letters that were sent just recently to a member of the U.S. Senate and to the President. And this, of course, relates to the whole idea of weapons of mass destruction. So in other words, I think tragically we have to keep in mind that the worst perhaps is going to be much more costly in terms of human lives and property. And again, the country is safer, but at the same time you cannot protect everyone everywhere. Now, we're coming to the topic which is directly and indirectly related to what's going on, at least in Boston, and perhaps we'll find out what's going on in the case of Texas. So I really think the whole issue of refugees has to be put in some sort of context on a number of levels. Number one, on the conceptual level. Number two, in terms of the historical lessons. And number three, in terms of the contemporary threats from the challenge of what we call refugeeism, and I'll come back to it, and the responses. So the bottom line is that that particular challenge was on the top agenda of the academic community for many years, for decades. And again, on a personal level, I would like to tell you that whenever I go to some area which presents some strategic and security challenges, I try to go to refugee camps and interview some of the refugees, the children, the grandchildren, and all that. And as a result of this, we try to also communicate our findings and data, and to share it with the academic community, with the international community, with international organizations, so forth. Now, let me say, before I introduce the very distinguished panel, just a few words as footnotes in regard to some of this issue. Number one, in terms of the concept or term refugeeism, and there are people who do not understand or do not share that particular approach to call the challenge refugeeism. And of course, it is debatable. But one thing is clear, that we're dealing with individuals or groups who flees from their homes and nation or country to somehow assure a better shelter for themselves and family because of persecution, as I mentioned before, because of revolutions, because of terrorism, because of war, and so forth. Now, obviously, the point, if you want to put the situation in a nutshell, one of the very wise sages a long time ago, in the Middle Ages, I think he said that a refugee is like a plant without soil and without water and without food and so on. And it is a terrible human tragedy, but as you know, King Solomon observed a long time ago that nothing is new under the sun, and the challenge of refugees is as old as history itself. Now, just a couple of footnotes, reminders, to put it in context before we discuss the contemporary situation. As you know, between the First World War and the Second World War, there were many refugees around the world, all the way from those that became refugees as a result of the Russian Revolution, or the Armenian refugees at the time, or some German refugees, even smaller groups like the Syrian refugees in connection with the Middle East, and so forth. And then, of course, the Second World War, which is still in our conscious and mind and soul. And again, on a personal level, I can tell you, my family or some of my family members, those who survived the Holocaust, for example, became refugees, and some came to the U.S., some came to Palestine, Israel, and so forth. But it's not a very simple experience to be a refugee. Now, as a result of the Nazi occupation, of course, of Europe, we know of the millions of refugees. We do know, of course, as a result of the Cold War situation, particularly the Hungarian, let's say, refugees who came in 1956. We know the situation in the sub-Indian continent between India and Pakistan, Korea, Vietnam, the Balkans, Africa, etc., etc. Now, what I thought would be useful for us to discuss is the terrible tragedy, human tragedy that we see and read about every single day. As a result, one of the indirect, I think, triggers of the so-called Arab Spring or Arab Winter, or the Arab Awakening, and so on. And particularly, obviously, I refer to the situation in Syria, which is a great tragedy. I can tell you, coming back last week from Turkey and discussing this situation in Turkey. Obviously, you will find a country like Turkey or Jordan or Lebanon that they cannot deal with this issue unilaterally. They need the support of the international community. So we have that problem. Then we have the problem of Iraq and the refugees in Iraq. And I remember Mr. Saliba here, that we were actually visiting some of the refugee camps in Syria a few years ago, looking at the Iraqi refugees, the Palestinian refugees, who were there for decades. And then again, I think we have to look at the situation in the Kashmir area. It still goes on for over 60 years. And most recently, the situation in North Africa, in the so-called Maghreb countries, the Sahel situation in Mali. And again, I can tell you from limited personal experience in that region that the refugee issue represents a major security concern. So we're going to discuss it today. In fact, while I was in Turkey last week, the president of Turkey, Abdullah Gül, he spoke very forcefully. He warned the European countries and other countries of the challenge of intolerance and violence and racism and discrimination and so forth. And he mentioned specifically, and I quote him when he spoke, that the migrants' main reason for the problems that we have relates to insecurity and crime and unemployment and poverty. So in other words, what I'm really saying is that while last week there was a conference on migrations and the effort of the international community to deal with that in Turkey, it really requires much more attention of the international community. So we have a program that I think would focus our attention on some of this issue. We are really delighted to have a first-rate panel of people who have very rich experience. And I think what I would like to do, we provided for you some bio-information on each one, so I won't spend time on that. So I think what we would do first is to ask our colleague, Dr. Stephen Morris, who is currently a fellow at the Johns Hopkins University. He has a very rich background at various colleges and institutions, Naval War College, Columbia University, and Harvard, and so on, to deal basically with some of the historical lessons and to take a case study on Cambodia, although he's doing now a book, he's working on a book related to Vietnam. So I'm going to ask him to begin to offer some insights into the lessons, the historical lessons that we have to learn in order not to repeat them in the future.
Very much.
Would you like to come up here because it's going? Okay.
Here, I'll move that chair.
Yeah, right. I think yeah, when he comes through.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. I'd like to start off by saying that we've actually had two major refugee outflows, or shall we say three perhaps, from Indochina, what was called Indochina, Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, during the 1970s, which created massive humanitarian problems and which was rooted in the nature of the regimes in power in all of these countries. The first outpouring came mainly from Vietnam in 1975, and that was the people who were associated with the former government and people who were politically active in organizations which were anti-communist, who fled often with the help of some individual United States officials, but more often than not on their own. And that was largely an American problem. It was a problem which was solved by the United States. Most of that refugees in that first phase, which was in 1975, made it to American territories, such as Guam, or to the Philippines, to Clark Air Base and territories which were under American control. And from there they were resettled in the United States. So the United States felt it had a moral obligation to take care of its former friends whom it had abandoned politically and militarily in 1975. So it never really became an international problem. But the second phase of the Vietnamese outpouring did, and that took place in the years 1977 to 79, and particularly in the years 1978-79. And the outpouring of refugees in this phase was a very, very different one. Socially, it was largely, not completely, but largely ethnic Chinese minorities. Vietnam had 10% ethnic Chinese population, and they were subject to discrimination and persecution by the regime as Vietnamese relationships with China deteriorated. And those relationships deteriorated largely over the situation in Cambodia, in which China and Vietnam had conflicting interests. So there was, in fact, an ethnic pogrom taking place in Vietnam, which caused the deportation, the expulsion of ethnic Chinese, largely with the collaboration of officials of the government of Vietnam, who took massive bribes in order to enable the people who wanted to leave the country to leave. And that became such a huge outpouring, usually in boats, and it affected most of the countries in the region. It affected Thailand, but it affected Malaysia, Singapore, the Philippines, even Indonesia. And the refugees were not given a very welcome reception in most of those countries. The first receiving countries tended to be hostile, and the local populations were hostile. And there are many stories of boats being pushed back out to sea. And the refugees were very much at the mercy of pirates who infested some of the waters of the South China Sea and in Southeast Asia. So that particular case became a huge humanitarian disaster in which the United Nations and the United States eventually had to work together and to try and get the countries of first reception to take the refugees temporarily until there could be a more permanent resettlement in other countries, in third countries, which usually turned out to be the United States, France, Australia, and Canada, being the major receiving countries. Now, in this instance, of course, it was very clear, it was absolutely clear to those who had wanted to be objective about the situation, that the cause of the refugee outflow was a deliberate policy of ethnic persecution in Vietnam by the government of Vietnam against the ethnic Chinese minority. Now, it wasn't really an example, though, however, of where there were greater strategic interests involved, political strategic interests involved for any of the countries of the region. The main problem for the countries of the region was the existence of these refugees, which they had to take care of. But there was no war going on inside Vietnam in which any external country had a stake in. Now, the situation in Cambodia was totally different, and the Cambodian outpouring took place in 1979 and 1980. And that came about as a result of events in Cambodia, in particular, the Vietnamese invasion of Cambodia. For the previous 3.5 years, Cambodia had been under the control of the Khmer Rouge, a radical, what I call hyper-Maoist regime, which created atrocious conditions for the population and caused the death of perhaps a quarter of the population of Cambodia. But the population of Cambodia was not able to exit the country during the Khmer Rouge regime because the borders were mined and heavily patrolled by the Khmer Rouge. It was only after Vietnam invaded that the structure of control of the borders started to break down. The mines were still there, and many people who tried to escape Cambodia in 1979 were killed by mines, but the soldiers patrolling started to disappear, and that created opportunities for refugees to leave. And there came to be a huge outpouring of refugees into Thailand. Now, this was a problem for the Thais. This was the first problem for the Thais. The second problem for the Thais was the existence of Vietnamese soldiers on their border. Now, what happened was that you had a huge civilian population living in Thailand, Cambodian civilian population living temporarily in Thailand in refugee camps, which were being taken care of by the United Nations High Commission for Refugees. But Thailand was very upset about this situation. On the one hand, the remnants of the Khmer Rouge began a guerrilla war against the Vietnamese invasion. But on the other hand, the Khmer Rouge, being extremely unpopular around the world, did not have the support of any of the other powers other than China. So basically China and Thailand collaborated with the Khmer Rouge in order to try and push the Vietnamese back away from the Thai border. Now, the Thais were not happy with the refugee flow, and they wanted help. And eventually what happened was that there emerged a non-communist resistance in Cambodia, coming out of the refugee camps, largely. They were not forced to join, but they voluntarily joined guerrilla armies which were loyal to the former monarch, Prince Sihanouk, or to a non-monarchical organization, the Khmer People's National Liberation Front. And those two non-communists forces became very heavily dependent upon the refugee camps for their source of soldiers. And this was something which was supported by Thailand because it saw the only solution to its refugee problem as a political settlement inside Cambodia. Now, that settlement didn't come for 10 years. And one of the reasons was the international disdain for the Khmer Rouge, which was the biggest component in the resistance to the Vietnamese occupation. But on the other hand, the international community didn't want the Vietnamese to occupy Cambodia and voted in the United Nations many times to the tune of something like 125 or 130 to 10 against the Vietnamese occupation. The only people who supported the Vietnamese occupation were the Soviet Union and its East European client states. The rest of the world opposed the Vietnamese occupation. But as I say, the struggle, the war lasted 10 years. And the main reason, and here there is an analogy with the situation today pertaining to Syria, the United States, whilst it opposed the Vietnamese occupation of Cambodia, was not willing to support armed resistance against the Vietnamese occupation. And one of the main reasons given was because a key component of the guerrilla resistance was the Khmer Rouge, whom were considered totally unacceptable alternative to the Vietnamese. Now, there was a non-communist resistance force, as I mentioned to you, which was also opposed, but the United States refused to provide weapons to the non-communist resistance. And it said that other people will have to do it. It was the equivalent of saying Bashar al-Assad has to go, but we're not going to do anything about it in terms of supplying arms. So they said the United States position was that the Vietnamese occupation of Cambodia must end. It will end. However, the United States is not going to provide weapons to the non-communist resistance. And the weapons that were supplied came from allies of the United States, namely Singapore and Thailand. The Association of Southeast Asian Nations, of which Thailand and Singapore were key members, took a position of active support for the non-communist resistance. But ultimately, it required the collapse of the Soviet Union for the situation, or the collapse of the Soviet Empire, shall we say, and the imperial aspect of the Soviet Union, in order for there to be a political agreement, which we finally got in 1989. And in 1989, we got the first elements of a political settlement, the negotiation between the Permanent Five, representatives of the Permanent Five of the United Nations, and the governments of Vietnam and in Cambodia, and the resistance forces. And it took 2 years, but as the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, an agreement was reached. Because the game was up for continuing Vietnamese occupation of the country. The Vietnamese actually had withdrawn their forces, and a political settlement was realized, and the refugee problem was solved. Once the political problem inside Cambodia was solved, the refugee problem was solved. But it took much longer than it needed to take, largely because the United States did not want to become too deeply involved in supporting forces which were sympathetic to America and American values. And here we see the analogy with the situation in Syria today, where the United States is extremely worried about the rise of an Al-Qaeda-oriented guerrilla force in Syria, but will not give direct military aid to the non-Al-Qaeda, mainstream, moderate Syrian resistance. The idea that various explanations were given, and we can discuss this later, but the main point is the United States had strategic objectives in Cambodia, which it wasn't willing to do everything possible to pursue. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for this historical lesson, which is obviously relevant to what's going on in Syria, as you mentioned, but elsewhere, which we're going to discuss with the other panelists. And the next panelist is Dr. Ralph Neuenberger, right here, who is a professor at the Graduate School of Liberal Studies, Georgetown University. And I recall very vividly when both of us were at the Center of Strategic International Studies of Georgetown, going all the way back to the late 70s, I guess, and early 80s. And he produced a major study on Congress, and he was teaching at Georgetown for many years. In fact, he received the Professor of the Year award for the graduate school. I think you began to teach about 75 or so. At any rate, I really asked him to provide another context to the whole issue of refugees. For example, some of the refugees in the Middle East, the Palestinian refugees, and most recently in Gaza, where you do have thousands of refugees registered through the United Nations. There were some riots and so on because the UN did not provide some of the funding, the cash at the time. And we have the whole issue of the Palestinian refugees for a long time. I also asked him, just in terms of some balance, to a reminder about the Jewish refugees from the Arab countries, and then to focus also on the situation now in North Africa and the Maghreb, the Sahel area in the south, and the Mali refugees, and some of his research that he has done in working closely with U.S. Congress.
Some of you may wonder how speakers get invited to speak at events like this. I got a call from Yona, and he said, would you be willing to come and talk about refugee issues, Palestinians in North Africa? And I said, okay, let's do it. And he says, no, not so fast. Before we allow you to come, you have to get a number of questions answered correctly. And if you get any of them wrong, we can obviously find someone else. And I said, okay, what is it? And he said, well, the first question is, do you know anything about the topic? And I said, well, yes, I've been working on Middle East issues for the past 30-some-odd years, and have had in and out of administrations teaching about it, and so I think I do. Let's do it. And he says, no, we've got some more questions for you. Because of all of the events taking place, particularly now, and this was before Boston happened, but with all the other events, he said, do you believe in the U.S. Constitution? And I said, well, yes. Every time I've been in the government, be it working on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee or the Commerce Department or wherever, I've always had to swear allegiance to the Constitution. He said, well, do you believe in all of it? And I said, yeah. And he said, what about the First Amendment? And I said, I guess so, yeah. And he said, what about that part in the First Amendment that deals with free speech? And I said, yes. And he said, good, you're going to give one. So Yonah and I have been, as he mentioned, been friends since the late 70s. Time flies when you're having fun. And one of the comments he made in his introductory remarks resonated with me, and that was when he was talking about his family fleeing from the Nazis. My parents did as well. My mother came to the United States in her 20s, and she passed away at age 95. And so she lived in the United States for 65 years or so, compared to 25 years in Germany, and yet always referred to herself as a refugee. And my father, who spent over 50 years of his life, much longer in the United States than he spent in Germany, always referred to himself as a refugee, and they referred to all of their friends as refugees. And it was very interesting. They internalized the concept of we had to flee from somewhere bad to come to somewhere else in order to survive. And that essentially is what the whole question of refugees is about. Yonah asked me to speak about 3 different refugee groups. The first being the Palestinian refugees, a topic that people talk about a lot, that is certainly in the forefront of diplomacy and trying to resolve the Middle East crisis. It is something I will go over relatively quickly because most people know a lot about it. The second is a refugee problem that is almost as long, the Palestinian refugee problem began 1947-48. The second one that I will focus on is one that is critical to North Africa, played a big role in the Cold War, and yet no one talks about it, or very few people, and that is the situation of the refugee camps as a result of the conflict called the Western Sahara, where somewhere ballpark about 100,000 people are being warehoused. Lavinia's excellent organization uses that term. In fact, I'm going to quote you a lot. And this is a situation that is horrible, and yet people don't talk about it. And then another refugee situation, which Yonah asked me to talk about, and that is Jews who fled from Muslim and Arab countries at approximately the same time as the Palestinian refugee crisis began. And here we're talking about ballpark anywhere between 600 and 800,000 people, and we don't talk about them at all. And the reason is, if you go to Israel today and try and find them, you couldn't. They are carrying a different title. It's called citizen. And they have been totally incorporated into Israeli society such that you can't tell that this person was a refugee from Iraq in 1949 and this person came from elsewhere. And so these 3 provide a very interesting different approach to the question of refugees. In terms of the Palestinian refugee problem, 2 things to look at. Number 1, the political aspect of it, and number 2, the physical well-being or treatment of these people. Specifically, how do they survive? As I'll talk about in the Sahel, where you have the UN Commission for Refugees, UN Commission for Refugees is totally different from the commission set up for the Palestinians, which is the United Nations Relief and Works Agency, UNRWA. In terms of the political aspects first, in order to understand the Middle East, the Arab-Israeli conflict, you really only have to look at 4 issues. There are hundreds of issues: water rights, environment, passports, visas, postage stamps, the list goes, trade, the list goes on and on. All of them would get resolved if you could resolve the 4 core issues. And those are, should there be a 1, 2, or 3-state solution? And if so, what should the borders be? Second, how do you provide security for the people there so that an Israeli mother can put her kid on a bus to go to school and not feel concerned that the kid is going to get blown up? And a Palestinian pregnant lady going to the hospital feels safe going to the hospital and not stopped so many times by checkpoints that she gives birth on the road. So security. Third issue, the fate of Jerusalem. Is there a way of dividing, sharing, or resolving in some way the future of Jerusalem so that everyone can claim victory? Because if everyone does not claim victory, the crisis and the problem remains. And the final question is refugees. The Palestinian refugee problem began as a result of what the Israelis call the War of Independence, beginning in 1947, ending in January of 1949. This is a war that the Palestinians and the Arab world refer to as the Nakba, the catastrophe. As a result of the fighting that took place, anywhere between 600 and 800,000 Palestinians wound up, or Arabs, wound up leaving their homes and being relocated elsewhere in order to survive. It is beyond the time that we have now to discuss why did they leave, and that is debated constantly by historians and politicians. Many left because they felt that they were in danger because of the fighting and it was safer to leave. Others left because they were told, get out of the way, we the Arab armies will kill the Jews and you'll be killed if you're not moved away. Others left out of fear from the Israelis. They looked at events such as the killings in places like Deir Yassin and left. Israelis claimed that they told Palestinians, don't leave, if you leave you can't come back. Whatever the reason is, ballpark 600 to 800,000 people left. The UN official estimate is slightly over 700,000. Israelis claim that's too high. Arabs claim it's too low. It doesn't matter. It's 600 to 800,000 people. And interestingly enough, that's almost the same number as Jews who wind up coming from Arab countries to Israel at about the same time. These Arabs who left wind up, and obviously a couple 100,000 Arabs remained in Israel and are today the Israeli Arab population. There are about 1.2, 1.3 million Arabs living in Israel. Those who left and their descendants are now approximately 5 million people. And they live, for the most part, obviously many have wound up in Western countries, around the Arab world, in the United States, but of the 5 million Palestinians refugees, which are the people who left and their descendants, about 1.5 million, in other words, a third of the Palestinians, still live in refugee camps. These camps are located in Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, and interestingly enough, in the West Bank and in Gaza. It's interesting because to continue to have Palestinian refugee camps in areas controlled by Palestinians raises obvious questions of why are these camps still there in those places. And the answer in part is because those Palestinians who are in camps receive assistance from an agency of the United Nations called the United Nations Relief and Works Agency, also known as UNRWA. UNRWA was created in 1949. It was supposed to exist for 1 year. Obviously, we have not yet reached the year 1950 because otherwise UNRWA wouldn't be there. I assume that the year just hasn't ended. There are some who feel that the existence of UNRWA perpetuates the conflict. Because if people are going to be guaranteed sustenance, food, aid, and so forth, why go and leave? UNRWA itself has no power to run the camps. They just provide assistance to those who are in it. UNRWA is the largest UN agency. It has a staff of about 25,000 people who work for it. It has a budget in excess of $1.2, $1.3 billion annually. It provides, among other things, the largest school system in the Middle East. And is the main provider of basic education for Palestinian children. It is the main provider of health care for those people living in the camps. As Yona said, in addition to providing humanitarian assistance, food assistance, they also provide cash. And in April, this month, I think April 4th or 5th, UNRWA said that they are no longer capable of providing cash to Palestinians in Gaza, which led Palestinians in Gaza to attack the UNRWA camps, the UNRWA offices, excuse me, leading to major protests about the role of UNRWA in the area. The Palestinians, each country obviously treats the Palestinians and their camps quite differently. The most unfortunate situation had been, until we've now come up with Syria, which produces a whole new set of problems, had been Lebanon. And the reason for that is that when the French left Lebanon, they tried to create a governing system for Lebanon so that the Christians would dominate the political structure of Lebanon. And every political office in Lebanon was based upon the results of a very controversial census that was taken in 1932 in Lebanon. They are still waiting for the absentee ballots coming in from Florida. As a result of the probably faked results, only Christians can vote for president. The prime minister must always be a Sunni. The speaker of the parliament must always be a Shia, etc. Well, the Palestinians who arrived in 1947 to 49, and then another influx of Palestinians arriving in 1967, and then another group led by Arafat arriving after Black September in September 1970, obviously were not there in 1932 and thus were not counted and thus are denied political rights. If you're in a democracy and you can't vote, you get very little. As a result, in Lebanon, Palestinians are by law not permitted to enter into a list of 70 professions, and their movement is quite restricted. The life in the camps is not very good. They have produced a cadre of potential terrorists, people who were angry at the quality of their life with good reason, who wound up being convinced by others in the Palestinian movement, ultimately by the PLO, to conduct terror attacks or violent attacks against Israel and against others. And so certainly the problem of the refugees in Lebanon was a major problem. We now have a new problem, and that is the problem of Palestinian refugees from Syria. Because of the situation in Syria, people who had gone to Syria as refugees now are trying to leave Syria. And many of them are winding up in Jordan, but some of them have tried to get into the West Bank, areas controlled by the Palestinian Authority, who do not want to take in their cousins, because taking in their cousins would imply that Palestinian refugees ultimately could move to the West Bank or Gaza, as opposed to what they refer to as the right of return. And this is really the key to understanding the Palestinian refugee problem, the right of return. They deliberately, in 1949 and 50, chose the word right as a takeoff from the American Bill of Rights. They believe it is their right to go back to the area or the places where they had their homes prior to their departure. And so maintaining this as their prime right, the right of return, is, again, one of the four key core issues to understanding the Arab-Israeli conflict. So with that as the background of the Palestinian issue, obviously it needs a political settlement, and until there is a political settlement, it is the goal of UNRWA to try and provide for the well-being of these people. And again, there are constant complaints and arguments pro and con. Do the schools provide good education? Do the textbooks acknowledge Israel on the maps in the school books? Is some of the money misplaced, and so forth? These issues come up constantly when looking at UNRWA. To shift gears and move to the other side of the Muslim world, to Morocco, you have a refugee problem which is brilliantly described in one of Yona's publications, Terrorism in North Africa and the Sahel. And in his recommendations, and if you haven't read this, this book is wonderful, or booklet. One of the things I do is I go up to the Hill frequently and I bring lots of copies of this because it is just so good, typical of the good work Yona does. But one of the recommendations, 3D, reduce the flow of recruits to criminal and terrorist groups and take a closer look at the refugee camps run by the Polisario near Tindouf, Algeria, with the purpose of developing long-term solutions that would reduce the attraction of criminal and terrorist recruiting. That's the end of the story. Let me tell you the beginning of the story. The refugee problem in the Sahel is a result of the outcome of the Spanish leaving what was called Spanish Sahara and is now called Western Sahara. In most cases, when European countries left parts of Africa, those parts of Africa ultimately became independent countries. The Spanish were colonizing the Western Sahara, and in 1975, when Franco died, the Spanish agreed to leave. There were a large group of people, known as the Polisario Front, who had been fighting against the Spanish, who said, "Oh goody, the Spanish are leaving, we're going to have our own country, isn't this wonderful?" Another large group of people said, "Oh goody, the Spanish are leaving, we're finally going to be able to rejoin Morocco, which we had been traditionally part of." As soon as the Spanish left, they agreed to turn over the territory to Morocco in exchange for fishing rights off the coast. It's relatively near the Canary Islands. The Spanish left, and immediately the forces who were interested in being part of Morocco and the forces who wanted to be independent started killing each other. Violent outbreak of forces committing terrible acts against each other. Thousands of people are killed, and ultimately, ballpark number around 30,000 people flee the area and wind up on the Algerian side of the border in a place called Tindouf. They left for one of three reasons. Number one, some of them may have been pro-Polisario, wanting independence and realizing this isn't happening and wanting to be in a place where they could work for independence. Second, they were just fearful of the fighting. If you're living in a neighborhood and people are blowing up houses around you, you've got to be pretty stupid to stay. And so they left, and this was a place where they could at least be safe physically. And third, quite a number of them were physically removed and wind up in these camps. The camps are on the Algerian side of the border. In 1991, the UN was able to arrange a ceasefire rather, and set up a peacekeeping force that is known by its initials MINURSO, MINURSO. It's French for UN Peacekeeping Force. And they were supposed to be there again for 1 year until the situation was resolved. Well, that year hasn't ended either. Once the fighting stopped and the people wound up, not the fighting stopped, but once the people wound up in the refugee camps, the UN turned this over to the UN Commission on Refugees, rather than creating a new UNRWA, again saying that this should only last for 1 year. Well, again, that year hasn't ended either. And this problem has not been resolved. The Clinton administration came up with a solution in the 90s saying that the territory should be Moroccan. However, the people should be given autonomy, with the exact nature of this to be negotiated at the UN. The Bush administration accepted this. The Obama administration accepted it as well. That said, there has been no political solution. And as a result, we wind up with about 100,000, give or take 10,000 or so people in refugee camps under awful conditions. And again, I'm quoting my source on what these conditions, Lavinia will probably talk more about it. Richard Black, the co-editor of the Journal of Refugee Studies and the director of the Sussex Center on Migration Research, referred the Sahrawi refugee situation as one of the oldest and most protracted case of warehousing refugees in the world. His research describes camps as tented cities supplied wholly from the outside. It is the most obvious case in the world of warehousing. Essentially, the UN provides everything for these people. Food, medical care, education, and so forth, but it's substandard. And there's probable cause of graft, of corruption of some of the UN supplies being sold in sub-Saharan Africa. The physical condition of these tents is awful. You can't imagine how awful it must be to spend summers in a tent in the Sahara Desert when the temperature reaches 110 and 120. The responsibility for this is obviously Algeria. It's in Algeria. They're doing little to help. And the Polisario, which is also doing little to help. They obviously are not allowing a census. We don't know how many people are there. And they also, again, Lavinia's group did a very good study on this. They don't allow the people to leave. There are police troops outside the camps, so that you have almost no capability of maneuverability. The United States Committee on Refugees and Immigrants gave Algeria a grade of F in freedom of movement and residence in this area, forbidding people to go back to Morocco. The Moroccans, interestingly enough, built housing for these people should they ever be able to get out. These are now empty houses in a city called Laayoune. So this problem must be resolved, and the way to resolve it is not to deal with the refugee problem, but to deal with the political problem. Come to a solution of that. Final, and this will go very quickly, the Jews who left Arab countries in the late 1940s, early 1950s, because with the independence of Israel, their life became very difficult and in many cases intolerable. They moved to Israel, where you can't tell that they are there now. They are not living in camps. They are living like every other Israeli. And that's the model ultimately that we should be thinking about. Steve mentioned with the refugee crisis being over. When it's over, people should be able to go and live normal, happy lives and move on with their situation.
Thank you for your mini course on the three difficult issues. Now we are moving on to other related perspective dealing with the immigration, I think, insights, and fortunately we have one of the foremost experts in the field, Mark Krikorian, who is the executive director of the Center for Immigration Studies. You have his bio. Is a prolific writer on many of these issues, and we were fortunate to have him speak on some of the related problems in the past. And I think particularly now, when there is this immigration bill and discussions about the role of the United States, should they open the gates or be more cautious about those who come in. And I think especially after, again, we cannot reach any final conclusions in regard to Boston, as we mentioned, but the reports about people coming in, and the question is, about their background, their intentions, and their contribution or lack of contribution to the American dream. So, Mark, why don't you take over?
Thank you, Yonah. I assume you knew everything that was going to happen over the past couple of days, and that's why you scheduled this panel discussion on today. So I want some stock tips after the program is over. I'm going to talk some about resettlement of refugees in the United States and sort of what's involved, what's at stake, what we should be doing about it. This is something I first became exposed to as an undergrad. I was at Georgetown when the Russians invaded Afghanistan. And I remember having gone to all the Vietnamese and Cambodian restaurants that we had in Northern Virginia and D.C. as an undergraduate. I said, boy, I hope Afghan food tastes good, because we're going to end up with a bunch of Afghans opening restaurants in the Washington, D.C. area. And that actually turned out to be the case. Maybe San Diego has Iraqi restaurants, I don't know, but I haven't seen any around here yet. The starting point for me looking at the issue of refugee resettlement in the United States, really generally in developed countries, but the United States specifically is what I'm talking about, is that resettlement of refugees should be the last resort. When all other options, only when all other options have been exhausted or are non-existent, should resettlement in the United States be even a consideration. And this was de facto the way we approached refugee resettlement for a long time. During the Cold War, it was a lot easier because Hungarians streaming west into Austria after the Soviets crushed the revolution there, well, they couldn't go back to Hungary. I mean, there wasn't a lot of options left. Things have become very different and much more flexible, much more ambiguous since then. And unfortunately, our refugee resettlement policy has strayed far from the idea of resettlement as a last resort. In fact, has often become a first resort. And there's a number of reasons that resettlement has to be the last resort. First of all, the number of people who could ever come, even under any scenario, is relatively small, and especially as a proportion of any refugee flow, is minuscule. The cost is actually quite significant. Now, this is partly because of our fiscal policies. We almost make it unavoidable for refugees to become public charges. People will end up on welfare for decades. It's really, I think it's a mistake. But the point is, the cost really is quite substantial, and local communities bear an enormous amount of that cost. And the local community part, I think, is relevant too, because much of our resettlement happens not in Brooklyn or in Los Angeles. It happens in small communities, small towns across the country, often because local churches are sponsoring the refugee resettlement, and so you end up with often very large flows of people in very relatively small communities. And they're almost never consulted or even informed that this is happening. Tennessee just passed a law, I believe last year, maybe the year before, trying to get the State Department to actually tell them that they're going to be sending people to these communities before they just start showing up. Really, much of what drives refugee resettlement is a kind of feel-good sentimentality. It's like, well, if we can, bring a few hundred refugees from Afghanistan here, that's great. That just makes us feel good, even though it's, a trivial percentage and can never be any more than a trivial percentage of the number of refugees in the world. And just as a few examples of refugee flows that I think are quite, honestly are quite problematic and contrary to this idea of resettlement of last resort, a big one was Soviet Jews. Not anymore, obviously, but we have a whole paper on this at our site by a professor from Israel. In late 70s, it was the first outflow. This is when they were Soviet Jews rather than after the fall of the Soviet Union. And they were given visas to emigrate to Israel, and they went to Vienna or to Rome, and then they were met and said, well, you know, you can come to the United States if you want, and a lot of them did. And the Israeli government wasn't happy about this, and as well they shouldn't have been, because the fact is these people had somewhere else to go, someplace that was welcoming them, and in fact had a whole infrastructure to acclimate them to the home society, and yet substantial numbers of them came here. The Somali Bantu is a particularly notable example, I've thought. The Somali Bantu are a subgroup in Somalia. The descendants of slaves, the people the Arabs had enslaved, further down the coast from what is now Tanzania and Mozambique, and their descendants, many of them lived in Somalia, and they were considered by the Somalis to be subhumans, and to this day still are. And so some of them ended up, because of all the dislocations there in refugee camps, Somalia didn't want to go didn't want them. They didn't want to go back to Somalia. Tanzania and Mozambique said, well, look, these are our long-lost cousins. You know, we'll take them back. But somebody needs to help pay us, you know, to dig wells and whatever to get these people settled. So, but the UN and the U.S. State Department said, no, 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 that's okay. We'll just move them to Milwaukee instead. It was absurd. And there's a question here related to the costs, is that $1 we spend on refugee resettlement in this country can go orders of magnitude farther in the region that most refugees are coming from. The Metskerian Turks was another group of people. These were Turkified Georgians whom Stalin, as he pretty much didn't like anybody, so he didn't like them either, and he rounded them up as the Germans were coming, because they would almost certainly have sided with the Germans, sent them out to Kazakhstan. After the Soviet Union collapsed, these people started filtering back. Well, what are we going to do? They're in Kazakhstan. They don't want them, or they don't want to stay there, and the Kazakhs don't want them. Russia is where a lot of them ended up, but the Russians didn't want them. Georgia is where their grandparents came from. Georgia didn't want them. Turkey is where some of them actually lived, and the Turks said, you know, really don't want them either. So the State Department said, oh, well, we'll take them all. Absolutely no excuse. At 4 other countries they could have gone to, and frankly, we should have insisted on it before any of them were brought here. I think to apply directly to my own ethnic group, Armenians from Azerbaijan fleeing the pogroms and the ethnic cleansing in Azerbaijan, they had a country to go to. It's called Armenia, and some of them went there. But many of them didn't want to. You know, it was poor, especially after the fall of the Soviet Union. It was actually very difficult. I mean, there were a couple of years where they were chopping all the trees down just to heat the houses in the winter. And a lot of them were Russified, Russian-speaking. And so some of them went to Russia, but we've taken a substantial number in as refugees into the United States. And there's no excuse for that. Absolutely none. Bhutan is now the largest, or one of the largest sources, depending on the year, of refugees resettled over the past several years. These are Nepalis who live in Bhutan. The Bhutanese don't want them, and either they don't want to go to Nepal or Nepal doesn't want them, and so we're bringing them here. Again, they have somewhere to go. It's not here. And finally, as a small example, the number isn't very big every year, but we take in a few dozen North Koreans every year. Why would we do that? There's a place that North Koreans can go to, and it's called South Korea. Again, a substantial share of our refugee resettlement is simply not justifiable. Now, this creates, I mean, significant refugee resettlement flows do create strategic and political problems as well. One thing they do, and this is a significant impact they have, is in the refugee camps or wherever the refugees are coming from, it often changes people's expectations, because there's this idea that, wow, I can win the lottery and move to San Diego instead of, you know, somewhere in this region that I'm frankly kind of sick of. And so it changes people's expectations significantly, so that instead of focusing on ways of either integrating into the country of first asylum or considering return, they dismiss those options. Those are simply not considered not things they want to consider, because they've got this chance to move here. It also, where there are refugee flows or refugee crises, where there's a kind of terrorism related issue, essentially we're talking about, you know, Islamic refugee flows, It spreads, it creates new host communities in other parts of the world and spreads networks that terrorists can take advantage of. Also, it creates terrorists and terrorist supporters with Western passports and Western ties, something that would have been much more limited without the refugee resettlement. And it imports quarrels, as it were, from elsewhere in the world that then complicate our reaction to various actions abroad. In other words, because of a large presence of Somalis here, or frankly the Chechen bombers in Boston, that then affects in some way our relations with the countries the people came from, or the countries those countries are at war with, or whatever. It changes and it limits our freedom of action in many ways, which frankly is, may not make any difference most of the time, but sometimes it does. Now, what do we do about it? Well, the first principle, it seems to me, is that assistance for refugees needs to be focused on the region people are in. It needs to be focused on helping people resettle either where they are or returning home. That has to be job one. Syrians in Turkey, it's become a serious burden, as Yona suggested, for Turkey. Moving them to Marietta, Georgia is not a solution. Helping Turkey resettle them, or helping Turkey deal with the refugee communities, needs to be the way we approach these refugee issues. Resettlement, as I said, should be last resort, but should be limited not simply to people who fit the UN definition of refugee, because the UN definition of refugee covers millions of people. Should be limited only to those people who both qualify as refugees, but who have nowhere else to go, will never have anywhere else to go, and can't stay where they are at all, period. That's a much smaller, dramatically smaller number of people than the total population of refugees. And to get back to my first point, sorry, about the trying to focus on ways of fixing the refugee problem where they are. One thing that always struck me about that was something you'd spoken about, was the Palestinians in the Middle East. I studied a couple of years in Soviet Armenia back in the 80s, and there were lots and lots of Armenians from the Middle East studying there. And there was one doctor doing his residency. He was from Aleppo. And he was, he kind of spoke about the pathetic situation that the Palestinian refugees who were essentially stateless, kind of in limbo. And his comment was, look, Armenians streamed into Syria after the Turkish genocide, and they even gave us citizenship, and we're infidels for these people, and they wouldn't even give their own people, their own co-religionists, citizenship. This is one thing that I thought an opportunity we missed. I don't know if it would have made any difference, but when we invaded Iraq, look, we conquered the place. It's a colony, at least for a while. We should have said, look, these Palestinians, you're giving them Iraqi citizenship, and we're just going to give them Iraqi citizenship, whether you like it or not. Now, would it have worked out? I don't know. The Iraqis didn't like them very much, but that essentially focusing on the issue of how to fix people's problem where they are is something I think we need to focus on. And finally, the last point is we need to think hard about the refugee, in this context, the refugee resettlement fallout of adventures we undertake abroad, because a substantial part of our refugee flow is essentially the backwash of various imperial adventures. Obviously, the Southeast Asians is a big part of that, Iraq, Afghanistan, and in a sense, our foreign policymakers need to take that into account along with all the other things that they're thinking about as the potential consequences of foreign policy involvement, and not what I have seen as a kind of implicit perspective on the part of a lot of foreign policy people, is that America is the hinterland that you throw your problems over your shoulder into because you're looking out rather than looking in. Unfortunately, too much of our refugee resettlement has been dealt with as a sort of way of fixing things that are more important, which is foreign problems, and somehow or another the people in Dubuque will just have to deal with it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mark. To have another perspective on this and related issue, Renan Limon, who is the President and CEO of the U.S. Committee for Refugees and Immigrants. Actually, during the Clinton administration, she served as Director of the Office of Refugee Resettlement at the Department of Health and Human Services, and I guess she had some experience in this area, and her organization obviously is involved for many years in looking at that particular issue from the humanitarian point of view, the American interest, and we invited her to share some of her views on that, and then we're going to have a Q&A discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor, and I just want to echo what a difficult day today is. Can I move this? Can you see any of my stuff? Thank you. We certainly share in the feelings of grief around what's happened in Boston today, and it's certainly a difficult day for all Americans, I think everyone around the world. And there is something very timely about this. I actually remember on 9/12 driving to work and thinking, gee, I've spent over 30 years of my life working with immigrants and refugees, and maybe I should take something else up. Maybe I should do pottery or something. And then I realized that no, it's really important to persevere with what you believe in, and bad things happen. And but it's very important to stay strong. I also appreciate actually being last to speak, because I get to respond, which is great fun. And I just want to say, Stephen, you were taking me back to my youth. I was working in Thailand and Singapore and Indonesia in the 70s, and was on the Cambodian border when people were coming across, and I thought you did a really good job of sort of evoking that time, which people seem totally have forgotten. And ultimately, we took over 1 million Southeast Asians to the United States, which is why we have such great restaurants. Ralph, thank you for the kind comments on our work with the Sawari and who are in Tindouf. And, I think what you said was really accurate. I visited Leun and talked to some folks who have escaped from Tindouf. And one of my colleagues, Meryl Smith, went to Tindouf. I'm too old to go do those sorts of things anymore. But he went, and it is horrific. And you can see our report on our website, refugees.org. And it's so classic example of refugees getting caught in the middle, and people using the different political forces, using refugees as chips in their bargaining game, and the refugees, really being the victims of all sides. And in this case, we completely agree that it has become a situation that is being exploited by criminals and extremists and other folks, and so that's really ugly. And thank you for paying attention to that one. No one does. No one does. And Mark, I've known Mark at least 25 years, right? And I don't think we've ever agreed on anything. So that's fine. We can still say hello and how are you and all that sorts of stuff. The U.S. Committee for Refugees and Immigrants has been advocating on behalf of uprooted people since 1911. That's 101 years. And I haven't actually been the person doing that all this time, but at least today it feels like it. Our mission is protect and serve refugees and immigrants, defending their rights throughout the world. We have been involved in refugee resettlement, have resettled over 500,000 people since 1975. We have partner agencies, 35 partner agencies around the country. And this afternoon I want to talk about the domestic and the political and the international issues around refugees. Excuse me. It's clear that since becoming a superpower that the U.S. has, after World War II, that the U.S. has been instrumental in providing protection and assistance to refugees through both international humanitarian assistance and domestically by resettling refugees in the U.S. I believe that these efforts are aligned with American values, are consistent with our history, and that it promotes a positive image of the U.S. overseas. It's simply put, it is smart foreign policy and makes us a leader in the worldwide humanitarian efforts. This policy also supports the principle of shared responsibility, since most of the countries that are hosting large numbers of refugees are developing countries, and that many of those developing countries are key allies of the United States. Current examples are Thailand, Kenya, and Jordan. We have also led the effort to create the humanitarian infrastructure that cares for refugees. It was referenced UNHCR, the other donor nations, and that infrastructure increases stability, enhances security, and allows for political support in countries that experience large influx of refugees. But the same humanitarian infrastructure has created over 8 million refugees who we term being warehoused. We define warehousing as occurring when refugees are restricted to camps or segregated settlements or otherwise deprived of their rights of freedom of movement or freedom to work in situations lasting 5 years or more. That's arbitrary. We came up with the 5 years. The 1951 Convention on the Status of Refugees does not use the word camp in the entire document. And the framers of this international law did not believe that refugees should be confined to a camp or denied any of their basic rights. And when you think about this, this makes a lot of sense because this was written in 1951. And if you were thinking about camps, what was your current reference? It was Hitler's camps and it was Stalin's ongoing camps with his gulag. But somehow in the ensuing 56 years, we've lost sight of this fact, and refugee camp has become like one word. You know, you have refugees, you have refugee camps. That's where the refugees live, refugee camps. That is actually contrary to international law, and everyone in the world breaks that law. Somehow protecting refugees has come to mean that we keep them in camps. We feed them near starvation rations. We don't allow them to leave. We don't allow them to work to support their families. They are subject to violence. They are subject to rape and selling sex for food. They have minimal health care, rudimentary education, and worst of all, no hope. And this goes on for 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years, 60 years now, and different with 2 and 3 generations. Many refugees who've been warehoused are sitting there today. We know that. And as these decisions are made, it's something interesting to think about. There were over 2 million Iraqi refugees that left Iraq after we invaded and because of the ensuing violence. Does anybody remember any Iraqi refugee camps? No. Why not? Because they trickled out. It wasn't like on CNN. And they couldn't tell, no one could tell the Iraqis from the Jordanians or the Syrians, right? So there were no visuals on this. But also, I think, America clearly didn't want refugee camps of Iraqi folks who had left because, or maybe in part because of the U.S. invasion. So the U.S. talked to Jordan and through intermediaries to Syria and said, you know, we'll help pay for them to access health care. We'll help pay for them to access education, and through the UNHCR, we'll help provide assistance through ATM cards to the most vulnerable of refugees. And so that's what happened. And so over 2 million people were living in Jordan, Syria, and surrounding areas with that kind of arrangement. I was in Jordan last year, twice, and when I got there, there were about 150 to 200,000 Syrian refugees. And I met with the Syrian government, and they're saying, this is just intolerable. We can't deal with this. We don't want to, but we think we're going to have to set up a camp. And I'm like, but you didn't set up a camp for over 1 million Iraqis. They go, well, this is different. Well, why is this different? Well, we're not getting the help that we need. Within 2 weeks after I left, they set up Zatri camp. And if you followed any of the news, this was a Jordanian and a UNHCR effort. And this is the international infrastructure at work. I visited that camp about 2 months later. It is horrific. People were just in horrible conditions. And this is what the international structure brought the Syrians who made it to Jordan. And now there's another camp opening, and there'll be another camp opening. So, you know, at USCRI, we started an international campaign to end warehousing. We've been talking about it for almost a decade now. It's unbelievable. As I like to say, because of all our efforts, not one refugee has been de-warehoused, okay? There is an agreement among all nations in the world that refugees, you know, it's easier. Let's just keep them in camp. Oh, yeah, okay, fine, we're violating their rights, but, you know, this is important, so they keep them there. So I encourage you to get on our website, and if you have any influence with anybody, please let them know that, you know, this is a violation of human rights because someone's been persecuted. And there was a time that there were good arguments against slavery. There was a time there was really good arguments against women being second-class citizens. And when we ended slavery and when we emancipated women, there were prices to be paid. Things had to change. So if you want to give refugees their rights, things will happen, and not all of them will be good. But I think we will have done the right thing. Now, domestically, America has always had a refugee program, from the Pilgrims to the Brew Indians. And we know that refugee resettlement is a life-saving program and an American tradition that provides that second chance to refugees in need of safety. Last year, we resettled 56,424 refugees from more than 60 nationalities. The current level of arrivals is low compared to historical admission levels. The average was over 200,000 a year in the 80s and over 100,000 a year in the 90s. One of the things you should realize, and it actually gets to Mark's point, we do occasionally agree on things, that less than 0.5% of any of the refugees in the world are resettled in a given year. So yes, it is winning the lottery. Absolutely, it's winning the lottery. Why does America bring refugees? Aside from it being consistent with our traditional values, typically we think of 3 reasons. One is foreign policy concerns. And I think we heard earlier about, for the Southeast Asians, these were foreign policy concerns. We took Vietnamese, we took Cambodians, we took Laotians, and that's a primary reason for bringing refugees. The other reason is domestic policy concerns, and the biggest poster child for that is Soviet Jews. It was the Jewish community in this country who said, we want these people free, and we are willing to step up and help and resettle them, and they did. And the Soviet Jews were resettled very well. They've done very well in this country. And the third reason is humanitarian. It's third for a reason. It's not used that often, but sometimes it is used, and that's a good thing. Most refugees are women and children. They come from different educational backgrounds. Some of them are educated. Many of them are not. They know they have to start a new life in the U.S. They know they have to work hard and start from the bottom. They do that. They contribute to communities, they pay taxes, they buy homes, they open businesses, they learn English, and they bring diversity and skills and great restaurants. We know that this is true. Yes, some refugees spend a lot of time on cash assistance. There is no test for refugees that they be able to be self-sufficient when they come to the United States. That test is for immigrants. But refugees, it's understood that if we bring a 70-year-old victim of persecution, that person is not going to be self-sufficient. They're going to be on Medicaid or Medicare. They're going to be on SSI. That's the way it is. We've made that decision. Say we as in the country, not USCRI. And yes, refugees are resettled in the community. It is a community effort, volunteers, churches, universities, students. It's a partnership with foundations and nonprofits and ethnic-based organizations, and it is directed by the State Department and the Department of Health and Human Services with infusions of money to help that start. But resettlement is a long-term process which some people do very well at, some people don't do well at, and I have yet to be able to predict who that might be. You'll be really surprised when you see some educated person end up, committing suicide, and some peasant ending up opening up 10 restaurants in their community and doing very well, thank you. USCRI is concerned with the migration of people, as I said, both forced and voluntary. We have observed that in this era of globalization, that the world expects instantaneous communication, the unrestricted movement of information and wealth, and goods and services. Everything moves at a breakneck speed, and yet people are surprised when people move as well. People have always been on the move, and now it's quicker, easier, and it's not just the people next door, it's the people from another continent. And we're really concerned that governments have reacted to the movement of people in very negative ways. Of course, one of the primary duties of government and the responsibilities of government is to define and protect its borders. So the rights of government to do that is not a question. But the methods of deterring refugees and immigrants, which include interdiction at sea, new and high-tech fences, summary deportation, extraterritorial detention centers, and forcible return without determination of refugee status, are sometimes illegal, often inhumane, and clearly mostly ineffective. So in an attempt to protect borders and control immigration, we see countries truly believing that if you treat refugees and immigrants really badly, that they'll go away. But you know what? That's never worked. They don't go away. We have to deal with it. It's not easy, it's not simple, it's not clear, but I think as human beings in the world, we need to figure this out. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. We're going to have some discussion very shortly, but I'm going to call first on General Dave Briscoe. He's the Vice President at the Potomac for Strategy and Planning, and I asked him actually to make some remarks, particularly because of his work in Iraq and dealing with some of these issues.
Thank you, Yonah. I do not have the qualifications of anybody on this panel. I will tell you, I'm a ninth child in a family out of 11 from Buffalo, New York, so in some cases I'm a refugee, I guess. Couple thoughts. You can't change where you were born or who your parents are. Political solution, that's an oxymoron in my opinion. And you can't house or feed the world, but when and where we can, we must. In 1982, I remember being in Manila in the Philippines as a first lieutenant in a beautiful hotel. I looked out my window right across the street against a cinder block wall, and there was a Philippine family living in a shanty. Let me describe a shanty to you. 8 by 8 made of cardboard. That was interesting. 13 years later, I was in Eritrea, and I'm driving from Asmara down to Massawa, 7,000 feet down to the sea. There was a refugee camp off to the side, about 40,000 people, the Special Forces Sergeant First Class told me. I looked over and I wondered, geez, I wonder what's going on in there and what's coming out of there. You got to think those things. Every Christmas, I watch like you probably do, the Christmas Carol. My favorite version is George C. Scott's version that came out, I think in the mid-90s. There's one scene that is exceptionally powerful in that, and I love this scene. If you've seen it, bear with me. The ghost of Christmas Present is visiting him, and he is visiting a family that's underneath a roadway. There's a mother, a father, and 2 children, and they're by a fire. George C. Scott, as they're listening in, as that movie shows, they're listening to the father who was able to bring home just an apple or a piece of bread. And the wife tries to console him, but the father feels guilty for not being able to provide for his family. I want to work, I have strong hands. At that point in time, the ghost of Christmas Present reflects back to George C. Scott, well, isn't there workhouses? Aren't there the places that he can go like that? And he said, well, I didn't mean those people. Then there's a back take, and the ghost of Christmas Present opens his robe, and there's 2 destitute children standing to his left and his right. And he said, these are the children of the world, ignorance and want. Across their brow is the word doom. And he says it with such power that if you're paying attention, you can't help but think about that. Now, the word hope was used. Picture if you weren't born in this country and you weren't sitting here in a coat and tie or a nice pantsuit or dress, and you didn't have food over there, and you were in one of these camps, what would you do? What's the hope? And if there's no hope to be offered, especially with social media and the globalization that's occurring, what is going to come created out of those camps, out of those people? Probably bad things. There isn't many good things that come out of those places, because desperate men do desperate things. Now let me go back to a statement that I started off with, that we can't house and feed the world. But when we can, we must. Because that those 2 children that George C. Scott spoke about, ignorance and want, is going to create a doomful society of more bad situations and characters in the world, Yona in the terrorism cell, because they are desperate and they will do anything to get out of there. Absolutely anything. And what the Marine Corps offers you is a chance to see the world. Sometimes you see some good things, and sometimes you see some very, very bad things. But the political decisions that are being made, and I don't make this comment lightly, please, it is no different from allowing a Marine to put a rifle in his shoulder and shoot a round down range to kill someone. Those political decisions are killing people. The thing is, we just don't see the impact at those refugee camps, mainly because we don't have to see those decisions. Now, this problem is tough, and you have a panel here that has offered all extremes, and I could argue and take side with all of it. But we've got to remember the world we're living in. It's getting more crowded with the social media that's going to expose those people that are going to be able to see this. And when they see it, and picture yourself now, if you saw something on the other side and you thought, I can get that, you're going to take it. And if you're hungry and you're cold and you're poor, you're going to do whatever you have to do to take it. That's culturally across the board. How are we going to get in the middle of that, keep the terrorism from being grown in those camps, let alone the terrorists that we're seeing growing not in those camps, because they're the desperate ones, and they will do anything for their family, just like that father underneath that bridge in the Christmas Carol. We've got to do better. I don't know the answer. There's some smart people that are working on it, but by God, we're the greatest country in the world. We're about hope. We're about idealism. And if we don't think about that, we're not going to be the leader in the world, and folks are going to go to another country maybe for that hope and idealism. So our challenge is immense. Thanks for the chance today. Thank you.
I really appreciate. I know that you have another appointment, but we started late, so I would suggest that we develop some sort of discussion, very rich observations and comments. We have in the audience also, I think people looked at these issues for a long, long time. I would like to call on you, Mr. Saliba, since you recently came back from Lebanon. And what's your take on this discussion And particularly, you know, at a time when Americans have to make some decision about the immigration law. And now the question is, the Turks, for example, tell me, and the Jordanians and others, they say, look, I mean, we have these refugee camps, but we cannot deal with this alone. How about the West? How about the United States to open the gates a little bit wider and to share that kind of humanitarian challenge? That if we keep alive this for 60 years or 100 years, we will have generations, I think, of people who would have no alternative, as the general indicated, but to resort to the gun. So maybe you can make some comments on that or question.
Well, thank you very much. I think, Professor Gunnar, as always, you assembled a very good panel, and I think they addressed the issue from different aspects. I would have liked to hear a little bit more about the Syrian refugees, which was not really the focus. I was in Lebanon, and I am following a little bit the situation in the Middle East in general. I can tell you that in Lebanon is a very small country, and in addition to the Palestinian refugees that are there and the economic situation that is not at all very good, the impact of the Syrian refugees in Lebanon is starting to really make bad effect, not only from an economic side, but also from the political side. As you know, Lebanon is divided as usual, and this problem is really hitting hard. And I think the government now, recently, I think last week, they decided to ask the United Nations to help with the consequences of the refugees coming to Lebanon. In addition to Jordan, of course, the Syrian refugees in Jordan, I think in Iraq also now there is some. But in Lebanon is a really serious question. I would like to thank the general here, which he really said something very important. The political decisions in the United States have a lot to do in every respect, and specifically in this matter. And a little bit outside probably the issue, but what I would like to say, when I came to the United States more than 20 years ago, I was really impressed, and I'm still impressed by the political system here. And regardless of how the people in the Middle East look at the United States as a country, they really, and this is something from my personal experience, they admire the United States for its political system. They were really impressed when they saw that a president, the most powerful in the whole world, has to answer to a prosecutor. I mean, you cannot understand how people look up to the United States, not as a policy or as a government, but as a society and as a people. And this is something I believe that the United States is uniquely in this particular time in history that can affect many places in the world, and I hope this would be for the good. And thank you very much again, General, and thank you for all the panel.
Any comments of the panelists?
Let me just jump in on Syrian refugees. Yeah, over 1 million Syrian refugees are already there. At the rate they're coming out, we're going to have 2 million by the end of the summer. This is an incredible humanitarian disaster that the long term, even if you set aside the actual human beings that are suffering this, which is enormous, but the long-term implications for the countries that are experiencing the influx are very, very serious. It's destabilizing Jordan. It's changed the Jordanian people's outlook on refugees very negatively. You mentioned Lebanon's having a difficult time. Turkey has stood up and did great things, and now we're being overwhelmed. And the international community has only delivered around 50% of the promises it made to help fund the humanitarian effort. And those promises were made about 8 months ago, and there's going to be another appeal because they're going to need more. They were based on the flow 8 months ago. Now there's even more refugees, half the money that was promised 8 months ago, and now they're going to need more money, and people aren't stepping up. This is a catastrophe. As it is now, it's going to get worse.
One point I wanted to make that relates to the Middle Eastern refugee issue, but really I think more broadly, is that too often when we look at this issue, when people from developed countries look at this issue, we seem to let the locals off the hook. In other words, it's the fault of the Lebanese and the Jordanians and the Iraqis that the Palestinians don't have citizenship and aren't integrated in those countries. That is a deliberate policy. We didn't do it. We're not responsible for that happening. The Syrian refugee crisis is the responsibility of Assad. He's the one who's created this situation. And I'm not saying that it is inappropriate for us to respond, but obviously it is, but it's not, we're not responsible for this. And we do not bear the moral responsibility for this. If the Algerians are imprisoning Sahrawi refugees right across the border from Morocco, that's the Algerian government is morally culpable for that. It's not our fault. It's not our responsibility to fix it. We may have a role, we may not have a role. It's not our responsibility to fix it. They're the ones who've done it. The Nepalese from Bhutan. This is Nepal and Bhutan have to work this out. It's essentially treating them as though they lack moral agency and moral responsibility. And I even say with the Indo-Chinese, remember this is obviously a long time ago, the concerns were, look, the Malaysians will push them back into the sea if we don't do something. That would be bad, but that's the Malaysians' responsibility. They are the ones behaving. It's not our responsibility to keep them good. That's always been my concern with much of the with the concern over how the countries of first asylum treat the refugees. They're the ones that are mistreating them. We're not.
Any other comments or questions?
Judge, I'd just like to make a general comment. Although I'm in favour of refugee, the free countries, the wealthy countries, doing something to accept refugees. One has to be aware of the fact that there is a cost in this, not the commonly assumed cost of welfare cultures, but the cost of criminality, because refugee populations are not screened in terms of background, and as a result you have criminal elements often who infiltrate the refugee community in order for an opportunity to get away from their former country and to go to another country where the grass might be greener. This happened, for example, in the case of Hong Kong, where a lot of the Chinese triads were exported to countries like Australia and Canada, and I think that you find that in other communities. You know, the Vietnamese have been a tremendous success as immigrants in Australia, but there is a core minority who are involved in organized crime. Same has been true of the Chinese immigrants, the Lebanese Muslim, mostly Muslim, not completely Muslim immigrants, but majority Muslim immigrants who came out during the Civil War, who were very actively involved in organized crime. Unfortunately, the majority of the populations are not guilty, and they are smeared by the activities of the minority, and this creates a real social difficulty. So my personal feeling is that one ought to be as far as possible compassionate but discriminating to determine whether in fact the refugee does have an option, an alternative option of migration to your country, to a wealthy country or not. Whether they are victims of persecution, a big issue. The persecuted definitely should be high priority, but the non-persecuted, it's another matter. So I think what I'm trying to say is it's a very complicated moral issue, and the West should be applauded for its humanitarian compassion over the last decades, as contrasted with the behavior of Western countries, including the United States, with the Jews during World War II.
Can I just
Yes,
say
please.
that in fact, refugees admitted to the United States are the most screened population of anyone who comes into the United States. There's 3 levels of screening that they go through all kinds of security. I don't even know. They don't tell me what databases and whatnot they do, but in any case, it takes months to get a refugee cleared through screening and to come to the United States. And obviously that has developed over years because there have been instances where people have come in as refugees. And I think your example of criminal elements is accurate. But, you know, when we think the United States has brought over 2 million refugees in the last 30 years, and really, you know, yes, all criminals are bad, all crimes are bad, everything that happens is bad, but the proportion is quite small. And what's interesting is, you know, we're going to bring in 60,000 refugees this year. They're going to be incredibly screened. And I think Mark would be the first one to say, and we're bringing 6 million other people who are not being screened that way, tourists and students and everybody else. So refugees are 1% of those people who come into this country and are the most scrutinized of any group that comes in.
I just want to say one thing about the refugees. They tend to come from worse off countries economically, and the countries which are worse off economically are countries which have less, what should we say, institutional structures of law and order, and therefore it's extremely difficult to get background checks on whether this person has been a criminal. It's a problem not only with refugees, it's a problem with legal immigrants, for example, from Russia. You can buy yourself a clean certificate from the police in Russia or in Cambodia.
Or a Nigerian high school diploma. I mean, there's no question.
So this is a very, very difficult problem, but I just throw it out there.
Okay, you have a last question, quickly. Ian?
Yeah, this question is for Mrs. Limon. So I know that the major cities in Syria are still being battled over, but I'm just wondering a little bit why the refugee situation should get a lot worse. Because I mean, unlike the Palestinians, they're not being excluded by another ethnic group from returning to their homes. I mean, once say their neighborhoods are taken over by the rebels or the opposition government claims more responsibility over their lands, shouldn't they be able to go back, albeit with a much less of a life to return to, but maybe some of these surrounding countries would just say, yeah, just go back. Things aren't so bad anymore. We don't want you as our problem.
Well, first of all, I mean,
I don't want to sound insensitive.
sorry?
I don't want to sound insensitive. I'm just
No.
curious.
I mean, it was brought up earlier about resettlement should be the last solution, and that's absolutely correct. Going home is everybody, including the refugees, preferable option. When I was in Jordan talking to Syrians, they were all like, you know, well, in a week or two, Assad should be out of there and I can go home. So that's, you know, but things are still really bad there, and the humanitarian situation, I mean, the violence is still raging, people are still being killed, there's no food, it's really bad. So when I say that more and more people are coming, I'm just talking statistics. Every day there's thousands of people coming across, and they know they're not coming to a good situation. They're, you know, if I was a Syrian refugee, I would want to go to Turkey. I think they're being treated best in Turkey, but it's still not great, and they definitely want to go home. So, you know, hopefully, I think we all agree, hopefully the war ends in Syria soon, and these people can go home, and that'll be great. There will be some people who will not go home. And then the question becomes, will they stay where they are? Will the countries around the region accept them, or will they be, you know, a combination of being there and being resettled? I also, I can't believe I'm saying this, I also agree with Mark about the responsibility of the countries that receive these refugees, because I was very disappointed. Turkey did a fabulous job. They put a lot of money into it. They had their own infrastructure, and they really worked hard to receive these and house these refugees well. Jordan had less, I think, less money, first of all, and less ability, and maybe some political willingness to do it. But basically, the U.S. and the humanitarian structure was saying, no, we'll come in and do it. We'll come in and do it the way we do it. I mean, this is an industry of building camps and taking care of refugees. It's $1 billion industry, and a lot of people make money. I'm sure, you know, I know these people, right? They care about refugees, they're humanitarians, they work hard, they work under terrible circumstances. But the concept of, don't worry, Jordan, we'll build a refugee camp over here and you won't have to deal with it, or Turkey, no, you want a check now? No, we don't do checks. We want to come in and run the camps. This is absolving, and I said to officials, why are you absolving these people of responsibility? They're you know, they're not basket case nations. These are people with an economy and ability to do stuff, educated populations who could work with the refugees instead of bringing in somebody like me to do it. And so, you know, it's kind of a strange thing that I think is an evolution, I actually believe.
Right. I think you know that we are planning to publish proceedings of that particular session. We're doing it with many other seminars, and to publish it also with the NATO journal and the electronic journal, and also a special report. So I would like to give copies. I think you have those. Oh, you don't have this one? Okay. Just I want to make sure that everybody. Well, you have it. So would you kindly pass it to our colleagues there?
Thank you. I got it.
And these two reports, and I will be in touch with you with the draft of your remarks, and if you could kindly go over it, and we're going to publish it and bring your views to a much wider audience in the United States and internationally. And I want to thank you for your extraordinary contribution to the discussion. As we academics always say, this is the beginning of study and not the end of it. Thank you very much.
Thank you. They got them and I have them.
Yeah, I got one.
You have one?
Yes,
Okay.
thank you.